Okay, so you want to own a private school, rent a building, hire teachers, enroll students, collect tuition every semester, like clockwork. Sounds like one of the most stable, recession-resistant businesses on earth. Parents will always want a good education for their kids. But here's the strange part. A well-run private school can genuinely post net profit margins of 20 to 40%, rivaling software companies. And yet, the largest education collapse in American history happened not because nobody wanted the product, but because the entire business model was built on federal money that could be switched off overnight. And here's the part that should really give you pause. One for-profit school chain took in $1.4 billion in federal student aid in a single year, operated over 100 campuses, and enrolled more than 70,000 students. Within about a year of the government simply freezing its access to that funding over allegations of falsified records, the entire company was bankrupt. Every campus was closed, and tens of thousands of students were left mid-degree with nowhere to go. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what it costs to open a school, why the margins can be so unusually attractive for a service business, why an entire industry can collapse the moment one funding source gets cut off, and what it actually takes to build a genuinely sustainable school. The three sizes of this business. Private schools come in roughly three sizes, and the capital required scales dramatically at each level. The smallest tier is a small independent school, typically 50 to 100 students, often starting in a leased or repurposed building rather than new construction. Realistic startup capital here runs $180,000 to $490,000, and the math is genuinely tight at this scale. A school charging $10,000 in annual tuition typically needs to enroll around 63 or 64 students just to break even. The middle tier is a mid-sized school built specifically for the purpose, serving several hundred students with dedicated facilities. This is where the real capital commitment shows up. Total startup costs for a mid-sized private school typically range from $2.5 million to $8 million. Once you include land, construction running $230 to $320 per square foot, and lease deposits on premium locations that can run $50,000 to $200,000 just to secure a 10 to 30-year agreement. The top tier is a large urban or prestigious institution with 400 or more students, capable of charging premium tuition up to $35,000 a year at elite schools, generating well over $2 million in annual revenue. At this scale, the business genuinely resembles the kind of institution parents are willing to pay a serious premium for: smaller class sizes, specialized programs, advanced facilities, and margins can push toward the higher end of the industry's range. Here's the number that matters more than any other in this business. The average cost to educate a single student typically runs $8,000 to $15,000 a year, covering instruction, facilities, and administrative support. Everything about whether your school survives comes down to the gap between that number and what you can actually charge in tuition, multiplied by how many students you can keep enrolled. Where the money actually comes from and why the margin can be so good. A private school's core economics look genuinely attractive on paper. Gross margins across the industry commonly run 60 to 75%, and well-managed schools achieve net profit margins between 20 and 40% annually. Numbers that would be considered excellent in almost any industry, let alone one built around something as seemingly low margin as education. Here's why the math works when it works. Tuition, once set, is largely predictable revenue collected on a fixed schedule semester by semester. Your biggest cost, teacher payroll, is the one lever you actually control, and industry data shows the schools that manage this best deliberately let staff hiring lag slightly behind enrollment growth, so they're never paying for capacity they don't need yet. A school charging $15,000 in annual tuition against roughly $2,000 in direct variable costs per student generates a contribution margin of about $13,000 per student toward covering fixed costs, meaning every student enrolled above your break-even point adds almost pure profit to the bottom line. Here's the part that breaks people's brains the same way a rigged casino game breaks a gambler's brain. That entire margin structure depends on one thing: consistent enrollment. A school with $1,200,000 in fixed costs and a $13,000 contribution margin per student needs roughly 92 or 93 students just to break even. Falls short of that number through demographic shifts, a bad local economy, or increased competition from a new school down the road, And a business with a genuinely excellent margin structure on paper can slide into a loss astonishingly fast because so much of the cost base is fixed, regardless of how many desks are actually filled. Why the largest education collapse in American history at almost overnight? You'd think that a school chain generating over $1 billion a year in revenue, with more than 70,000 students enrolled, would be about as stable as this industry gets. Corinthian Colleges shows exactly how wrong that assumption can be. Corinthian, operating career college campuses under brands including Everest, Heald and WyoTech, had grown into one of the largest for-profit education chains in the country, taking in $1.4 billion in federal student aid in 2013 alone. That number is the entire story. Unlike a traditional private school funded by tuition parents paid directly out of pocket, Corinthian's revenue depended overwhelmingly on federal financial aid flowing through its students, in the form of loans many of those students had no realistic path to repaying. In 2014, the US Department of Education requested detailed compliance records, and when Corinthian failed to fully respond, the department placed a temporary freeze on its access to federal financial aid. That freeze alone was enough to trigger the collapse. Corinthian was forced to sell roughly half of its 107 campuses and close the rest almost immediately, and by 2015 it filed for bankruptcy entirely, shutting its remaining 28 schools and leaving 16,000 students without classes overnight. The buyer, who took over dozens of the surviving campuses promising an ethical turnaround, ended up closing nearly all of them within a few years too, unable to overcome what industry observers called the fundamentally difficult economics of running career colleges once enrollment and funding both softened. Corinthian wasn't an isolated case. ITT Technical Institute, operating over 130 campuses, met an almost identical fate 2 years later. The Department of Education cut off its access to federal aid citing accreditation concerns, and within weeks ITT filed for bankruptcy and shut down every single campus, leaving the government to potentially cover approximately $500 million in outstanding federal student loans. The lesson isn't that every school is one funding freeze away from collapse. A traditional private school funded by direct parent tuition doesn't carry this exact risk. It's that any school business built around a single concentrated revenue source, whether that's federal aid or one dominant local employer whose families make up your enrollment, is exposed to a collapse that can happen in weeks rather than years, no matter how large or established the institution appears from the outside. How smaller schools actually lose this money. 3 ordinary patterns explain most private school struggles below the scale of a Corinthian-style collapse. Pattern 1. Overbuilding ahead of enrollment. A school that commits to a large, expensive facility before securing enough committed students to hit its break. Even threshold is carrying fixed costs, the lease, the construction debt, that don't shrink just because enrollment came in below projections. Pattern 2. Staffing ahead of demand. Hiring teachers to match hoped-for enrollment growth rather than actual confirmed enrollment is one of the fastest ways to turn a strong contribution margin per student into a real operating loss, since payroll typically represents the largest controllable expense in the entire budget. Pattern 3. Underpricing tuition relative to true per-student cost. A school that sets tuition based on what nearby competitors charge, rather than its own actual cost to educate a student, can end up in a position where even full enrollment doesn't generate enough contribution margin to cover fixed costs, a mistake that only becomes visible once the first full year's books are closed. What you actually walk away with. Scenario 1. A small, independent school, around $300,000 invested, enrolling 75 students at $12,000 in annual tuition. That's $900,000 in gross revenue, and at a solid 25% net margin once past the break-even enrollment threshold, roughly $225,000 in real annual profit. Genuinely attractive, provided enrollment stays consistently above that break-even line year after year. Scenario 2. A mid-sized suburban school with 200 students at $7,500 in tuition, generating $1.5 million in annual revenue. At a 30% margin, achievable once economies of scale kick in across a larger student base, that's $450,000 in real annual profit. the point where this becomes a genuinely resilient business, cushioned enough by scale to absorb a bad enrollment year without the kind of overnight collapse that hit Corinthian and ITT Tech. So if you're chasing this business, remember the real rule of this industry. The margin structure is genuinely one of the best on this channel when enrollment holds steady. The entire business is also one funding disruption, or one bad enrollment cycle away from a fixed cost structure that no longer has enough revenue behind it, a lesson that took down one of the largest education chains in American history almost overnight.